And welcome back to Coaching with the Bible, Season 2, Episode 11, overall number 65. Our reading this week, the portion of Vayigash. Our subject this week, choosing the leader. My favorite team, no surprise to a good portion of you, are the New York Mets. Baseball has always been that sport for me, more than the others, for whatever reason, and the New York Mets are my team, and I've been suffering for a very long time as a New York Mets fan to have some sort of glory, some sort of championship, some sort of victory. My wife is a New York Yankees fan and always told our children to select the Yankees over the Mets because they'd have a much happier result and much better results and a much happier future by why not choose a winner? And that makes a lot of sense. And the reason I raise the subject of the Mets right now is because it happens to be that as we're looking at the subject of choosing the leader, that the New York Mets right now are looking to choose their next manager. And as you read articles or listen to interviews or wherever they may be on any of these sort of sports channels, and I try to avoid them because it's a painful subject, because ultimately I have no faith that they're going to win. You listen to the things that people talk about as to what are the qualities that make the right leader for that team, and what are the wrong ones. And then when you hear certain names that pop up, potential candidates, you think, oh, is that the right person? Is that the wrong person? Do I even have an opinion here? Do I even have a right to an opinion here? Do I even know what I'm talking about? But some names inspire and some names don't, and some names attach themselves to winning and some don't. And really the truth is we have no idea a lot of the time. We can look at track record, we can look at history, we can look at anecdotal evidence from other people, we can look at all kinds of things to make that decision. The question then comes down to is, well, how do you choose? How do they make that decision? What are the criteria that they're using to make that decision? And so I saw an article that made the point, which is that too often we are choosing leaders poorly. And we think about a person in advance. Sometimes we know in advance, like immediately we have that gut reaction that tells us that, yeah, that person's not going to survive, they're not going to succeed, it's not going to work. We have that blink moment, like a Malcolm Gladwell kind of a thing, where we just know intuitively that that person's not going to work out. And sometimes we're wrong, but a lot of the time we're right. And one of the reasons that it is this article that I saw on CNN on this subject, and the following was the statement. The short answer is we focus on all the wrong things, like a candidate's charm, their stellar resume, or their academic credentials. None of these has any bearing on leadership potential. And despite claims to the contrary, even a candidate's past results have little bearing on whether the promoted individual will succeed once promoted. That is to say that on occasion you'll find a person, you're looking to hire somebody, you're bringing somebody in, and you look at their resume from outside and it looks good. And then when you bring them in, it's a disaster. Or the reverse. You look at a candidate and it's pretty mediocre or standard, it doesn't stand out in any way particular. But you bring them in and they succeed at a very high level. And so how does that work? Where does that come from? And the reason I bring it up this week specifically is literally one comment in the reading about the idea that Jacob chooses Judah to lead them down to Egypt. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But how do we sort of know that? And typically speaking, when we're choosing leaders, if we're choosing, are we choosing good leaders or bad leaders? And how can we learn to do a better job of choosing better leaders rather than bad leaders? And what are the indicators, the key indicators for that kind of thing? So the most obvious thing is that you're looking at a situation and it's situational. So you're looking at, what are the goals that we're trying to accomplish? What are the responsibilities of the person who's going to lead? What are the qualifications needed for the position? And then based on that, you sort of go about the process. Look at what we talked about last week in terms of hiring in general, or putting someone in charge in general. We talked about humble, hungry, smart. And that very much, I think, plays into this. But it's curious as to sort of how we go a little bit deeper. So this is almost like a continuation to some degree in the reading in the Bible, but also with respect to what we talked about last week in hiring. But how do we choose leaders? What are the things that we should be looking for? What are the things that we shouldn't be looking for? The things that we should avoid. And so in the Bible this week, after Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and after the brothers return back home to inform Jacob that his son is alive and that he leads and is the viceroy in Egypt, they now have to go down to Egypt. And they're going to live there for a while. And the question is, how do they do that? And so we talked a number of weeks ago about Jacob being trained as a planner for these kinds of things. And we've actually seen Joseph put some of that also into motion in his role as the viceroy, as the leader in Egypt. But now as they're going down to Egypt, and they have to live there, so how does that work? And so the verse tells us, this is in chapter 46, verse 28, that Jacob sends Judah down first to Joseph to a place called Goshen. And so it seems like just sort of an innocuous comment. Okay, so very nice, he sends Judah down first. Like, what does that have to do with anything? So the famous commentary, Rashi comments and says sort of two things on that. One is to find a place for them to live, right? So set up the house. And two, to establish a place of learning for them while there. Meaning that not just a physical space to live, but also to establish the spiritual space for the family. So Jacob chooses Judah to do that task. And the question is, why Judah? That's the question of the week. It took me a little while to get there. I apologize for that. But the question is, why specifically Judah? How does he get that task? Now, to some degree, he has self-selected because of his work earlier on in the story in taking accountability and ownership and responsibility for Benjamin at the end of last week's portion into the beginning of this week's portion, into stepping forward and pleading before Joseph to free Benjamin to take him home and that they can't leave him there. So on some level, Judah has stepped out above and beyond his brothers. Although, again, if we're looking at things, his earlier history does not portend well for great leadership. He does not step forward in a great way with respect to the moments when Joseph is in a pit and he has the opportunity to save him, and he really doesn't. And so that doesn't work out quite well. It doesn't work out in the next chapter where Judah's involved in this whole activity, this whole story with Tamar, and that's doesn't appear to be a great moment of time for Judah. Even the verse sort of says at the beginning that he went down, and the commentaries explain that Judah going down means that he was looked at as less in the eyes of his brothers, that he had been diminished in their eyes. So him stepping forward at the end of last week, him stepping forward at the beginning of this week, to some degree has moved him and separated him positively out in the eyes of Jacob when obviously he learns that story, so puts him in that space. But what else is there? What else is there? So some of the commentaries simply state the following. There's a difference between being the spiritual leader and being the leader. And so the tribe of Levi and the tribe of Issachar, who are known over the course of history as the tribes that either are the priests or are the great rabbinic leaders. Again, that's the history of it. And so they lead on the spiritual side, but Judah, having stepped out and stepped forward in this route, in this space, is the leader that they need for this. And so by virtue of being the physical leader, what we would call ultimately the kings, right? That's the house of David, is the house of Judah. And so he fits the role, right? So if we're talking about having the qualifications for the role, if we need to set up a space to live, he is maybe the right person to do that, even better than Joseph is the right person to do that, because Judah has lived in the house of Jacob for the last 20 plus years. He also doesn't live in the house of Pharaoh. And so Jacob trusts Judah and his qualifications and his accountability level to establish the right physical home and also to establish the right spiritual home. In other words, Judah meets the criteria for the leadership position that's there. But let's take it a step further. One step further that's brought down one of the commentaries is that in fact Joseph likes Judah. Even though earlier on, maybe it wasn't true, we know that Joseph had a bad relationship with his brothers, and that Judah in that moment didn't exactly help him. But by virtue of the fact that Judah steps forward and takes responsibility for Benjamin, to save Benjamin, to free Benjamin, to bring Benjamin home, he has curried favor in the eyes of Joseph. And so Jacob puts a person in front of Joseph who has curried favor in his eyes because he wants an alliance. He wants a good relationship. Now, they're both his sons, but also he wants it to work. So he's not going to send the person down in front of Joseph who is maybe the ones who put him in the pit in the first place, right? Simon and Levi, but the brother who has now stepped forward. But to take it even a step further, in this wonderful work called the Be'er Yosef, written by Rabbi Yosef Salant, who I mentioned a bunch of times last year in season 1, he makes the comment here, one additional factor with respect to Joseph. Sorry, wrong sefer, I made a mistake. Actually, not that book. A book by the name of Shemen HaTov, The Good Oil, written by Rabbi Weinberger, Rabbi Bernard Weinberger, who's my father's teacher back in high school. He makes the comment that's a little bit further. And when we think about it, which is this. In the story where Judah saves Benjamin from the house of Joseph, right? He saves him from the Pharaohs, he saves him from prison, he saves him from a life of servitude. The storyline that Judah takes is deeply personal and deeply difficult for him to say out loud. He's speaking about all the things that are true about the family and all the things that are true about Jacob's love for Rachel, Jacob's perspective of Rachel as the number one wife in the team, Jacob's perspective that Joseph and Benjamin are his two sons from that wife, above others, above all. And he uses that as the tool to free Benjamin from the life of servitude and slavery. And Joseph hears that. And that's a deeper level of respect and honor and dignity. And that is the leadership quality that Jacob sees in putting Judah in charge of this task. And so when we think about leaders, when we think about how do we develop leaders and how do we find leaders, we're looking for certain qualities and we're trying to avoid other qualities. We're looking for the things that actually resonate, the things that actually work, and we're trying to stay away from the things that don't. So charisma, perhaps, right? Someone has a lot of charisma, that's great, but it doesn't necessarily translate into being an actual leader. It doesn't actually mean that anyone's going to actually follow that person. It doesn't actually mean that the person's going to be present and successful. We're looking for someone, obviously, who is present. Absentee leaders are a disaster. They're basically incompetent. They're getting all the benefits of leadership, but they're not actually doing anything. And so it's a real disaster, sets a team back. And so we're looking for the qualities. And what are those qualities that we're looking for with respect to the leaders that we choose? And so let's think about that for just a moment. Think about it. What are those things? So here's just a couple. Number one, does the person fit the business? In other words, can they adapt to what's going on? Again, they could be good in a big business, they could be good in a small business. That doesn't matter. Can they be the right person for this business? Have they built teams for businesses like ours? Have they built communities, programs, whatever those things may be, so that it works for us? In other words, it could be that the person's great for a more senior team and not right for the position that's a more junior situation. Number two, is the person open to learning? Are they willing to listen? Goes a little bit back to the humility thing we've talked about in the past with respect to great leaders. But are they open to listening to the people around them? Are they willing to have a learning curve about the industry that they're now in to figure out what's best for the role that they're now in? It's not simply just a question of confidence and arrogance, right? Certainly we're looking for a mix of confidence and not a lot of arrogance, but that willingness to humble itself, to really open to learning. Otherwise, it's a disaster. And then, really, is the person followable? Like, this is a really core thing. Can the person be someone who others will, run through a wall for lack of a better term? Someone who others will really, spend the extra time, go the extra mile, do the extra work, because either that person works super hard, puts in mass effort, shows up all the time for the project and for the team and for their teammates, or otherwise, whatever the reason may be, or they're just a great motivator in terms of getting the best out of people. And so they're followable one of those two different ways. And if those three things sort of exist, if you want to just boil it down, right, hungry, humble, smart, like I talked about last week, a little bit of proactivity like I talked about last week, but also, do they fit? Are they open to learning? And are they followable? Really, at the core of it is what you have. And really, that's what you see with respect to Judah. Judah leads in that way. Jacob believes deeply in his ability to lead in that way. He sets up clearly, with the help of Joseph, no question about it, a home for the people of Israel that's going to last for an extended period of time, that allows them and it puts them in a position, in a situation that ultimately, they can actually leave Egypt successfully, albeit after hardship, great hardship, after many, many years in that hardship, in that slavery. But one of the keys to their success and their ability to go is the fact that they exist in Goshen, that they exist somewhat separately. And so it's that combination of Jacob trusting in Judah, Judah also working in concert with Joseph, putting that into play so that ultimately it leads to great success over the course of time. So all those things are in play. And that's the question that we want to ask ourselves today. When we're looking at leaders, when we're looking at opportunities for leadership, are we choosing the right people? Are we choosing the wrong people? What are the criteria that we're using to choose those people for those roles? And then let's look at our track record. How have we done in the past on these? How has this worked in the past when we're trying to select other people? Have we gotten it right? If we've gotten that mix right before, then we can use that mix of questions and the criteria for what we're trying to do now. If we've gotten it wrong, so then like everything else we've talked about, it's time to be honest, it's time to be open, time to reevaluate, and to look for potentially another plan. Okay, that is Coaching with the Bible for this week. Look forward to seeing you next week.